You know, usually when we talk about driving, there's this fundamental, totally unquestioned expectation of control.
Right. It's just basic mechanics.
Exactly. I mean, you turn the steering wheel a quarter inch to the left, and this heavy machinery just goes left.
Yeah, or you press your foot on the brake pedal, the friction engages, and the car stops. It's totally reliable.
Right. It is a direct binary relationship between your input and the machine's output. And honestly, it's deeply comforting. We base our entire daily existence on that kind of predictability.
Oh, absolutely. It feels safe. The human brain really craves that direct feedback loop. We need the environment to be responsive to our commands just to feel secure in the world.
We really do.
Yeah.
But okay, imagine for a second that you are driving down a long stretch of highway at like 70 miles an hour.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
You feel the hum of the road vibrating through the floorboards. Your hands are perfectly positioned at 10 and 2. You are looking at the road ahead, making all these tiny subconscious micro adjustments to the wheel just to stay perfectly centered in your lane.
Right, just cruising.
Yeah, you feel completely, undeniably in charge of the journey. But then for whatever reason, you glance down under the dashboard and you realize something absolutely terrifying.
Uh-oh. What is it?
The steering column is entirely disconnected from the front axle.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's just hovering there in the air. The car is actually on autopilot, running on an entirely independent system. You just thought you were driving because the wheel happened to be in your hands and you're making the motions.
Wow, that's a brilliant, if utterly anxiety-inducing image. I mean, that's the absolute definition of a shattered illusion of control right there.
Like,
The exact moment you realize your input is entirely cosmetic.
exactly. You just thought you were driving. And that terrifying realization that our hands are on the wheel but entirely disconnected from the actual mechanisms of reality, well, that is exactly the tension we are dissecting today.
It is a huge topic.
It really is. So welcome to the Deep Dive. Today is Friday, May 29, 2026. And the grounding material we are pulling apart today is this comprehensive, deeply analytical document titled 07 Dependence from Language to Reality.
Yeah, it's quite a title.
It is, and it is a profound theological and practical critique
Yeah.
of modern leadership, specifically within Christian formation, but, I mean, with massive implications for anyone who leads anything, really.
For sure. The core argument is it's fascinating. It argues that the concept of, quote, dependence on God, which is, supposed to be the absolute bedrock of faith, has basically devolved from a lived operational reality into something that is merely decorative language.
Decorative language. I love that phrasing. And that's really the mission of our time today. We want to extract the most vital insights from this material regarding how human beings, how we navigate this incredibly uncomfortable tension between the illusion of control and true operational dependence.
Right, because we all struggle with that.
We do. And so if you're listening to this right now and you're deeply religious, this is going to challenge your daily practice. But even if you are not religious, but you are insanely curious about leadership psychology or organizational behavior, or let's be honest, why you feel chronically burnt out despite being super successful, there's just so much to unpack here.
Oh, totally. We are basically looking at a radical alternative to our culture's absolute obsession with speed, efficiency, and just, well, total autonomy.
Exactly. Okay, let's unpack this. To really get at this whole autopilot phenomenon we just talked about, we have to start where the author starts, which is the profound difference between what people say about dependence and what they actually do.
Right. And the foundational premise here is that most of us just categorize dependence completely wrong.
We do. How so?
Well, we treat dependence like a mood, We think it's an emotion, like that feeling of peaceful surrender you might get after a really great meditation session or a moving church service.
Oh, right. Like a Zen feeling.
Exactly. But the argument here is that dependence is fundamentally an action. The text says it is operational before it is emotional.
Operational before it is emotional. That's a huge shift.
It really is. You don't just feel dependent. You literally do dependence. I mean, it shows up in the mechanics of how you make a hiring decision, how you handle a sudden drop in revenue, or how you interpret a forced season of waiting.
But the reality is, right, our culture has reduced this gritty, operational reality to just a devotional phrase. It's become sacred shorthand. And the term that really jumped out at me in the reading was practical deism.
Oh, yeah. That's a heavy one.
Let's unpack that, because it feels like a stinging indictment of how people actually live.
It really is. So just for a little context, Historical deism is the philosophical belief that God created the universe, wound it up like a giant complex clock, and then just stepped back, like hands off, letting it run on its own natural laws without any further intervention.
Right, the clockmaker God.
Exactly. Now, what this material points out is that very few religious leaders today would actually call themselves deists. Like, they believe God is active.
Of course. That's kind of the whole point of their job.
Right. But practically, in the day-to-day machinery of their lives, they are operating as if he is entirely peripheral. So they pray the prayer in the morning, but the actual decisions they make at 10:00 a.m., 2:00 p.m., and 4:00 p.m. are entirely driven by market forces or anxiety or personal ambition.
Wow. It's this incredibly strange gap between confession and conduct. I mean, I hear people say all the time, oh, I'm waiting on God. But when you look closely at their behavior, what they actually mean is, I'm waiting for circumstances to align with my exact preferences, and I'm just going to slap a spiritual label on my procrastination.
Yes, that is exactly what happens. They pray for guidance, but they proceed as if their very first gut instinct is already undeniably infallible.
Yeah. So if we look at the psychology of this, it's really about how language functions as a mask, isn't it?
It is. Over time, that devotional vocabulary becomes a kind of, I don't know, a holy accent almost, that covers up a deeply ingrained habit of self-reliance.
A holy accent. That's good.
And the source material actually anchors this in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 15. Jesus quotes the prophet Isaiah, saying of the religious elite, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me."
Right. So the language is impeccable. The theology is totally sound. But the operational reality is entirely autonomous.
Exactly. And the author uses this brilliant metaphor of spiritual language becoming like furniture.
The furniture metaphor. Yes, I wanted to talk about this.
Okay.
Okay, so think about this. You buy this beautiful antique armchair. It's gorgeous. It looks incredibly impressive in the living room of your soul.
Right, a real statement piece.
Exactly. But nobody ever actually sits in it. It is completely unused when it comes to the actual heavy lifting of living in that house. It's literally just decoration.
Just taking up space and looking good.
Exactly. But okay, let me push back on this for a second, because I really want to be fair to human nature here. Aren't these phrases, saying things like, the Lord will make a way, or I'm seeking his will, aren't they just how people naturally express faith when they're in the dark? Are they really that harmful?
That's a fair question.
I mean, if you're listening right now, think about your own corporate environment. How often do we use buzzwords like, we're circling back, or we're aligning our synergies? We do it just to mask our own anxiety or our desperate need to feel like we have a handle on the chaos, right? We all use shorthand to survive the day. Is it really that malicious in a spiritual context?
Well, that's a crucial distinction the author makes. It's not necessarily malicious, right? And the author isn't saying the words themselves are inherently bad or empty.
Okay, so what's the actual danger then?
The danger is cognitive dissonance. When there is a chronic, ongoing gap between the vocabulary we use and the reality we actually live, the language eventually constructs a completely false world.
We start believing our own PR.
Yes. We start to confuse our fluency in the language of dependence with the actual act of obedience. You think to yourself, well, because I just spent 10 minutes talking about trusting the process, I have actually trusted the process.
Oh, wow. So the talking replaces the doing.
Precisely. It inoculates you against realizing how deeply you are actually relying on your own speed, your own intellect, and your own influence.
So this beautiful decorative furniture of our vocabulary is actually hiding a much deeper, much more uncomfortable human neurosis, which is our desperate craving for the illusion of control.
And that brings us to the real psychological heavy lifting of this material, the absolute burden of autonomy.
And it really is a crushing burden. The claim made here is that human beings are remarkably skilled at living autonomously while simultaneously speaking the language of trust and surrender.
Oh, we are experts at it.
Right. And this gets to the absolute root of human stress, anxiety, and burnout. A massive amount of our modern psychological distress comes from living in direct rebellion against our, quote, creaturely limits.
Yeah, that phrase, creaturely limits, is so important. We inherently, biologically, desperately want to be omniscient. Like, we want to know exactly how the economy will shift next quarter.
Right. And we want to be omnipotent. We want to control our children's future or, our company's stock price.
Exactly. And we want to be omnipresent. We want to be in every single meeting, managing every variable at once.
We fundamentally want to be the gods of our own little universes.
We really do. But control is described in the text here as a fragile God. It promises safety and it promises predictability. But it simply cannot deliver because the universe is just way too
So
complex.
it just ends up breaking us.
Yeah. It only exhausts the people who worship it. I mean,
Yeah.
think about the sheer neurological toll of this. To be your own God means your amygdala is constantly firing because you have to constantly manage every possible variable to avoid suffering or failure or disappointment.
And no human nervous system can survive that fantasy intact for very long.
None. It's biologically impossible.
Which brings me to an analogy I was thinking about while reading this section. We basically treat our lives like we are the CEO of a massive corporation.
Oh, I like this.
Yeah, so we sit at the head of the big mahogany table, we set the 10-year vision, we dictate the aggressive quarterly strategy, and God, well, God is just an external consultant we retain on a modest retainer.
Right. Someone we occasionally call for a specialized meeting.
Exactly. We bring him in when the quarterly numbers look disastrous or when there's a sudden PR crisis, like a health scare or a sudden financial collapse. We ask for a little strategic advice. We ask him to rubber stamp the recovery plan we already drafted ourselves, and then we politely walk him to the elevator.
Thanks for your input. We'll take it from here.
Exactly. But the argument the author is making here is that we are fundamentally not the CEO. We are, at best, middle management stewards, carrying out a vision we didn't write.
That analogy perfectly captures what the author calls the hidden theology of control. Control feels vastly safer than surrender because it offers the illusion that if we just work hard enough, we can completely eliminate risk.
But we can't.
No, we can't. There is a deep dive in the text here into the book of James, specifically James chapter 4, which directly addresses the arrogance of the calendar.
Oh, right. The part about making plans.
Yeah. So James writes to these business people who are saying, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and do business and make a profit. And James basically corrects them, saying, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that.
And it's funny because if the Lord wills has totally become one of those decorative furniture phrases we were just talking about. People put Lord willing at the end of an email right next to best regards. But it's not meant to be just a polite sign-off.
Not at all. The text describes it as a theological revolution because it completely dismantles the fantasy that time itself is our personal property. It forces this agonizing realization that tomorrow is not a possession, it is a mercy. Planning isn't condemned. I mean, obviously we have to plan, but planning that forgets the creator, planning that assumes total sovereignty over the timeline is what destroys the soul.
So basically every calendar, every Q3 projection, every 5-year plan remains entirely contingent.
Exactly.
To ground this a bit, let's look at some of the historical precedents provided in the source. Think about the ancient Israelites' journey in the wilderness. They are this massive group of refugees with zero infrastructure.
Right out in the desert.
Yeah. And God provides manna, this bread-like substance from heaven. But the catch is, he only provides exactly enough for one single day at a time. The economic anxiety there must have been completely off the chart.
Oh, for sure. Human instinct screams, I need to hoard this. I need to gather a week's worth of manna and put it in a silo so I can actually sleep at night.
Exactly. But when they tried to hoard it to secure their own future, it literally bred worms and rotted. They were being violently forced to learn how to live by daily provision rather than long-term possession. They had to learn the agonizing discipline of receiving rather than controlling.
It's the literal retraining of the human reflex. And similarly, look at the classic story of David facing the giant Goliath.
Right.
David explicitly rejects the impressive human resources offered to him, like King Saul's armor and the conventional mastery of warfare. He walks out there with a sling and a handful of rocks, but his reliance wasn't on his skill with the sling. His reliance was on a covenant confidence.
It wasn't managing the variables. He was trusting the relationship.
Exactly. And perhaps the most poignant and, frankly, difficult exposure of this illusion of control that the text brings up is the reality of human suffering.
Yeah, that part was incredibly heavy to read. It makes the point that when your life is stable, when your income is steady, your health is good, your relationships are humming along, self-sufficiency can very easily masquerade as spiritual maturity.
Oh, absolutely. You think you're doing great and that you're super spiritually mature because everything is fine.
Right. But suffering strips that mask away violently.
Because suffering introduces variables you cannot manage. I mean, in the sudden loss of a spouse, or in a chronic illness diagnosis, or in years of agonizing unanswered prayer, the soul is forced to confront that it is nowhere near as strong or capable as it imagined.
It breaks the illusion.
Completely. But rather than framing this as some tragic failure, this perspective frames suffering as the harsh, necessary doorway into deeper reality. Suffering exposes the absolute limits of self-reliance. It forces a person to stop trying to manage the universe and actually learn true dependence, recognizing that our very breath is upheld by grace, not by our meticulous life hacking.
Okay, so let's pause here. If control is a toxic illusion, right? And if self-sufficiency is just a culturally celebrated mask, and if the goal is to give up our CEO status, the natural, logical assumption for someone listening is going to be, all right, fine, I will just sit back on the couch, cancel my meetings, stop striving, and let the universe or God completely take the wheel. I'll just be passive.
Right, the Jesus take the wheel mentality.
Exactly. But this framework aggressively, emphatically rejects that idea, which brings us to the necessity of redefining passivity and understanding the intensely active nature of dependence.
This might be the most common and honestly the most dangerous misunderstanding of faith. There is a persistent tendency to think that if God is completely sovereign and in control, then human action is essentially optional.
Like, it doesn't matter what we do.
Right, we equate dependence with a sort of pious spiritual paralysis. But biblical dependence is never lazy. It never uses faith as an excuse for inaction. The phrase the author uses here, it's just brilliant. True dependence, quote, never baptizes indecision.
Oh, I love that. Never baptizes indecision.
Instead, it is defined as ordered responsiveness.
Ordered responsiveness. Let's dig into that because it really implies kinetic energy. You are still moving, you are still acting, but you are responding to an order, to a rhythm, to a directive that originates outside of your own ego.
Yes. It requires a highly nuanced view of human agency. You can think of dependence as the narrow bridge between two massive errors. On the left side, you have the error of self-reliance, the belief that human skill, grit, and intelligence are entirely sufficient to achieve the goal.
The hustle culture mindset.
Exactly. And on the right side, you have the error of spiritualized passivity, the belief that because God is in charge, human effort just doesn't really matter. But true dependence holds together ferocious discipline and absolute faith. It marries intense planning with deep prayer.
And the ultimate anchor for this concept in the text is found in the Gospel of John, chapter 15, the famous metaphor of the vine and the branches.
Oh, yes. Such a perfect illustration.
Right? Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. Apart from me, you can do nothing. And the way this document unpacks it is so illuminating. Think about a branch on a grapevine. The branch doesn't sweat and strain and stress out trying to manufacture a grape.
Right. It doesn't read self-help books on grape production.
Exactly. It's not taking a master class on fruiting. The fruitfulness is entirely derivative. It comes naturally from the union with the vine. You cannot produce abiding, lasting fruit by yourself. But, and this is the critical part, you still have to actively, intentionally abide.
You have to do the work of maintaining the connection. You can't detach yourself and expect the sap to flow.
Exactly. And when you look at the historical case studies of this, it becomes undeniable. Look at the biblical figures. Noah didn't sit under a palm tree quietly contemplating the theological concept of deliverance.
No, he spent decades engaging in backbreaking, grueling labor to build a massive physical ark.
Right. And Abraham didn't just feel a warm sense of destiny. He packed up his entire household and marched across the known, hostile world. Moses didn't just pray for liberation. He literally walked into the throne room of the most powerful, tyrannical dictator on earth and demanded it.
And Mary said a terrifying yes to an impossible calling that risked her reputation and her life. Paul reasoned in synagogues, survived shipwrecks, planted complex communities, and wrote profound theological treatises.
Their labor was physically and mentally intense. But at every single point, their intense labor was subordinated to a higher initiative. They didn't view divine dependence as an excuse to avoid action. They viewed it as the very fuel and meaning of the action itself.
Exactly.
So let me ask a highly practical, pointed question here, both to you and to the listener driving in their car or sitting at the desk right now. How do you actually know the difference?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. In real time, how do you know if you are being actively dependent, engaging in this wholly ordered responsiveness, or if you are just procrastinating? How do you know you aren't just putting off a terrifying conversation, or a tough firing decision, or a major career pivot under the spiritual guise of, well, I'm just waiting on the Lord's timing?
It's so easy to do that.
It is. So think about a decision weighing on you right now, listener. Are you making plans with open hands, ready to pivot if directed? Or are you just paralyzed by the fear of making the wrong move?
I mean, it requires intense self-honesty to answer that. The difference usually lies in the hidden root of the behavior.
What do you mean by the hidden root?
Well, ask yourself, are you delaying an action because you are actively engaged in seeking wise counsel, fasting, praying, and brutally examining your own motives? Or are you delaying because you are terrified of the optics, afraid of failure, and secretly hoping circumstances will just force the decision so you don't have to take responsibility?
Oof, that is convicting.
True dependence still builds the spreadsheet, it still drafts the difficult email, it still makes the plan. But these acts are held loosely as acts of obedience. It is the deep conviction that our best effort without God's breath is entirely empty. But God's presence is never intended to be a substitute for our diligence.
Wow. Okay, so on an individual psychological level, this active, ordered responsiveness makes perfect sense. It's hard, obviously, but it makes sense.
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when you scale this up? What happens when you get 50 or 500 type A-driven, highly intelligent people together in a company or a church? What happens when a whole leadership team slowly forgets this and slips back into the comfortable rhythm of autonomy?
That brings us to one of the most sobering concepts in the entire text. The insidious danger of functional independence within systems.
Functional independence. It's a quiet crisis.
It really is. And this is where the analysis moves from personal spiritual formation into profound organizational psychology. Functional independence is just a brilliant diagnosis. It describes a state where successful ministries, nonprofits, or corporate leadership systems continue to operate with remarkable, visible effectiveness. But they have completely lost their living, breathing dependence on real-time divine guidance.
So the machine still hums perfectly. The annual budgets are balanced, the marketing campaigns execute flawlessly, the branding is culturally relevant, the seats are full. To the outside observer, it looks like massive success.
Yes, on paper, they're winning.
Right. But internally, the system itself is entirely deaf. It no longer listens.
Exactly. And the most dangerous part of this hidden drift is how it actually begins. It almost never starts with a massive moral scandal or a sudden, dramatic theological collapse. It almost always starts with something we generally praise, which is competence.
Wait, competence is the problem.
Well, an organization works hard, they learn what connects with people, they build a model that scales, they discover a fruitful rhythm. And competence is a gift. Order, excellence, strategic planning, these are all really good things. But the fatal trap springs when that competence slowly morphs into emotional and operational self-sufficiency.
And the phrase from the text that gave me literal chills was, repetition replaces revelation.
Yes. That line is devastating. The corporate memory of past guidance substitutes for the hard work of present discernment. The team might still open the board meeting with a prayer, but the prayer has become totally ceremonial.
It's just checking a box.
Exactly. When they say we prayed about it, what they functionally mean is we already agreed among ourselves based on the Q2 data, and we asked God to bless the data. The system has perfectly memorized the formula for past success, but it has completely lost the capacity to recognize a new voice of direction.
So I was trying to picture this while I was reading, and I came up with an analogy.
Huh.
Functional independence is essentially like a state-of-the-art high-speed bullet train. The engineering is absolutely flawless. The aerodynamics are perfect. It can travel at 300 miles an hour with incredible efficiency. But by its very nature, a train can only go exactly where the steel tracks have already been laid down.
Right. It has a predetermined path.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the conductor suddenly gets an urgent radio transmission saying the bridge ahead is out, turn left immediately into the field, the train literally cannot do it. It is entirely fatally bound by its own predefined rigid structure. No matter how fast or shiny it is, it cannot adapt to a new directive.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the concept of interruptibility, which is a core metric of health in this framework.
Interruptibility.
Yes. A truly spiritually healthy leadership system, no matter how large or successful, maintains its interruptibility. Like, can a major initiative be delayed at the last minute if the team realizes discernment isn't clear? Can a highly profitable strategy be completely abandoned if there is a genuine sense that the Lord is redirecting the path?
And an autonomous, functionally independent system cannot be interrupted.
No, it cannot. It is entirely bound by the momentum of its own metrics, its PR commitments, and its financial overhead.
To show what interruptibility actually looks like in practice, there is a stunning historical counterexample provided in the source. The early church in the city of Antioch, found in Acts chapter 13. When I read this, considering how modern organizations operate, it completely blew my mind.
It is a radical, paradigm-shifting model. The text highlights that the church in Antioch was preparing to send out Barnabas and Saul, who were essentially their top-tier talent, their absolute most gifted communicators and leaders.
They're star employees?
Exactly. But they didn't arrive at this decision through a strategic planning retreat. They weren't looking at a demographic map of the Mediterranean, trying to figure out how to scale their brand presence. The record actually says they were worshiping the Lord and fasting.
They weren't even strategizing. They were just ministering to the Lord.
Exactly. They were in a posture of complete availability. And in that atmosphere of deep worship and fasting, the Holy Spirit spoke and gave the specific mission. Set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. The mission was received, not manufactured in a boardroom.
Wow.
And think about the profound trust required to actually execute that order. A functionally independent system, your bullet train, would hoard its best talent. You don't give away your best executives. You need them to ensure your own institutional survival and growth.
Right. You lock them into non-competes.
Exactly. But a dependent system releases them, trusting that the God who called them out is infinitely bigger than the local inventory of talent.
Releasing your absolute best people because you received a directive while fasting. I mean, imagine a modern startup giving away its best engineers to a competitor because the CEO felt convicted during a meditation retreat. It is the complete, terrifying opposite of modern organizational strategy.
It really is.
But the Antioch church was only able to hear that directive and act on it because they were already in a posture of waiting. Which brings us to a massive paradigm shift regarding how we actually communicate with the divine. This takes us into the author's redefinition of the role of prayer, specifically prayer as actual strategy, not just ceremony.
In the vast majority of leadership circles today, both secular and religious prayer is treated as a polite, formal opening. It is a devotional punctuation mark before the real serious work begins.
Yeah, you bow your head, someone says a quick, eloquent prayer for blessing and unity, you say amen, and then you immediately open the laptops and the spreadsheets to make the actual decisions based entirely on human logic.
Right. It's the ribbon-cutting ceremony. You snip the ribbon with a giant pair of scissors, everyone claps, and then you get down to the actual business of running the store.
Yes, but the argument here is forceful. Prayer is not the ribbon cutting. Prayer is the architectural blueprint. It is the highest, most critical form of strategy.
It is. It is not a magical lever we pull to control God or steer him into endorsing our brilliant ideas. True, dependent prayer is the specific space where human urgency is deliberately, sometimes painfully, slowed down so it can be cross-examined. It is the furnace where actual wisdom is forged.
The author points out the tragedy of what he calls prayer after the fact. And man, this is so convicting.
Oh, it really hits home.
Right. This is when we make a complex decision by human consensus. We run all the numbers, we figure out all the logistics, we get everyone on board, and then we pray. We are essentially asking God for a divine endorsement of a decision we have already locked in. We say, Lord, please bless this specific plan, instead of going in empty-handed and asking, Lord, what is your plan?
When you look at the psychological mechanics of this, strategic prayer is fundamentally about active, aggressive listening. In the silence of genuine prayer, hidden, ugly motives are exposed.
Like what kind of motives?
For instance, a leader might go into prayer feeling incredibly urgent about launching a massive new initiative. But in the quiet, they might discover that the urgency isn't actually a divine calling at all. It is entirely rooted in insecurity. It's a fear of becoming culturally irrelevant or a desperate desire to look successful to rival peers. Prayer, when done right, tells the brutal truth about the state of the soul.
But wait, let me push back here on behalf of the highly practical listener. Is there not a massive danger here of over-spiritualizing every tiny, mundane detail of life?
Sure, I can see that concern.
I mean, does a nonprofit board really need to go on a 3-day silent prayer and fasting retreat just to decide what color to paint the lobby? Doesn't God give human beings frontal lobes, logic, and basic common sense for a reason?
It's a vital pushback.
Think about your own habits, listener. Do you ever ask people for advice when you've actually already made up your mind, just because you want the emotional validation? Are we supposed to paralyze ourselves analyzing the spiritual implications of paint swatches?
Well, the material is careful to address this exact trap. It absolutely does not advocate for spiritual paralysis or the suspension of common sense. Remember the earlier definition. Dependence never baptizes indecision.
Right.
The point is not to agonize over trivialities, but to ensure that the governing realities, the core trajectories of our lives and organizations, remain fully permeable to God's intervention. Look at Jesus as the ultimate historical model here.
Okay.
He certainly didn't lack common sense, intelligence, or innate authority. Yet, the texts record that he prayed all night before choosing the 12 disciples. He agonized in prayer in Gethsemane before facing the cross. He wasn't praying as a token, public acknowledgement to look pious. Deep, agonizing communion with the Father was the very atmosphere, the oxygen of his action.
And the example of Nehemiah, I love this part. Nehemiah is a cupbearer to the king of Persia. He hears that the walls of Jerusalem are destroyed. He is utterly devastated. But he doesn't just run into the throne room the next day in a fit of passionate activism.
No, he waits.
Right. The text points out that he prayed and fasted for months before he ever approached the king to ask for permission to rebuild. The entire geopolitical strategy to rebuild a city was born out of a prolonged, prayerful burden, not just a burst of human ambition.
Right. And what happens when we genuinely use prayer as our primary strategy is that it almost always reveals a deeply uncomfortable truth. Our human timeline is usually completely, fundamentally misaligned with God's timeline. We want resolution immediately. True prayer often introduces agonizing delay.
And that tension, the friction between our timeline and God's, is the perfect bridge into understanding the battle between urgency and discernment, or the lost discipline of waiting.
Oh, this is so relevant today.
We live in a society, a digital era, that is literally biologically allergic to delay. If a web page takes 4 seconds to load, our blood pressure spikes. We inherently subconsciously equate speed with wisdom. If we act fast, we think we must be smart.
The author notes with incredible clarity that urgency can mimic conviction flawlessly. Yes. Urgency arrives dressed in a very serious suit, speaking in a fast, authoritative voice. Because something feels intensely emotional and immediate, our brains just assume it must be morally right. But the argument is that urgency is very often just fear wearing a disguise. It is the fear of missing a fleeting opportunity, the fear of losing control of the narrative, the fear of looking slow or incompetent to our competitors.
Urgency asks one question: what action will make this internal pressure stop right now? But discernment asks a completely different question. What is God actually requiring of me in this specific moment?
Exactly. Discernment is defined here as the patient, excruciating art of seeing reality clearly before making a move. It requires active listening. Waiting in the biblical sense is not doing nothing. It is a highly active form of obedience.
That contrast between pressure and calling in the text is so beautiful.
It really is. Pressure is coercive. It screams, do this right now or you will lose everything. Calling is invitational. It whispers, follow me into this, at my pace, in my time.
I was thinking about how to describe urgency, and I realized it's exactly like drinking salt water when you are dying of thirst in a lifeboat.
Oh, that's a visceral image.
Think about it. In the exact millisecond you swallow the salt water, it feels like a brilliant solution. It wets your cracked throat. Your brain gets a tiny dopamine hit of relief. But if you look at the physiology, human kidneys cannot process that much salt.
Right.
To flush the salt out, your body actually has to pull water from your own cells, expelling more water than you drank. It literally accelerates your dehydration and kills you faster. That is organizational urgency.
Wow.
You make a panicked, urgent hire just to put a warm body in a seat because you're stressed. It feels like relief for a day. But 6 months later, managing that terrible hire takes up exponentially more of your time and resources than if you had just endured the pain of leaving the seat empty and waiting for the right person. You moved fast, but you moved wrong.
That is a phenomenal, biologically accurate metaphor for exactly what the text is diagnosing. The fix actually poisons the system.
So practically speaking, how does this material suggest we actually differentiate between a genuine open door that we're supposed to walk boldly through and a dangerous shortcut driven by the salt water of urgency?
The text provides several powerful biblical case studies that act as diagnostic tools for this. The prime, devastating example of the pain of premature fulfillment is the story of Abraham and Hagar.
Okay, tell us about that.
Well, God had clearly promised Abraham that he would have a child, an heir. But a decade passes. The biological realities are screaming that this is impossible. The promise seems delayed beyond human endurance. So Abraham and his wife Sarah decide to take matters into their own hands, using Sarah's servant, Hagar.
Right, and from a cultural and practical standpoint, in the ancient Near East, it was a totally logical, strategic solution to a delayed promise. They were just, helping God out.
Exactly. But it was an attempt to manufacture fulfillment rather than endure the wait to receive it. The text points out that what looks like proactive initiative can sometimes just be deep unbelief wearing a very productive mask. They get a child, Ishmael, but the interpersonal and historical fallout of that shortcut creates generations of pain. The right outcome, an heir acquired the wrong way, based on a manufactured timeline, becomes a wound rather than a blessing.
In sharp contrast to that disaster of urgency, the text brings up the prophet Elijah on Mount Horeb. Elijah is exhausted, he's terrified, and he's desperately looking for God's direction. And he experiences this massive, spectacular wind that shatters rocks, then a violent earthquake, then a raging fire.
Everything in our nature expects God to be in the spectacular, the urgent, the loud event.
Exactly. But God's voice wasn't in the earthquake or the fire. It was in this sheer silence, the gentle whisper that only came after the noise, completely settled.
This raises a massive question about how we tune our attention. The author notes that the loudest thing in the room, or the loudest, most frantic emotion in our own soul, is very rarely the truest thing. We are culturally conditioned to respond instantly to noise and crisis. But true discernment requires the deeply countercultural discipline of letting the earthquake pass, sitting in the silence and waiting for the whisper.
But we also don't want to just sit around forever.
Right, and crucially, the text also balances this by using the story of Joseph fleeing Potiphar's wife as an example of swift, immediate discernment. When propositioned, Joseph didn't say, "Let me go fast and pray about this for 3 days." He literally left his coat and sprinted out of the house instantly.
But that wasn't fearful panic, right? It was absolute moral clarity.
Exactly. Discernment doesn't mean you always move at a snail's pace. It means you always move with clarity, entirely unclouded by fear, ego, or mere appetite.
So if a human being can actually master this, if they can learn this excruciating art of waiting, if they can actually make prayer their architectural blueprint, if they can resist drinking the salt water of urgency, the argument here is that it literally, fundamentally changes the moral fabric of who they are. Which brings us to the culmination of this deep dive, the moral shape and practical habits of a dependent life.
This is where the theology becomes deeply ethical. The text argues that dependence is not just a mystical mood or a private, invisible devotional habit between you and God. It is an ethical formation. It changes how you treat other human beings.
How so?
Well, the burden of self-sovereignty, the subconscious need to hold the universe together, to micromanage every outcome, to constantly curate and preserve your public image, is a crushing weight. And when people carry that weight, it makes them harsh, controlling, manipulative, and chronically anxious.
Because if you genuinely believe you are your own savior, you can never ever afford to fail. Failure isn't just a learning opportunity. It is an existential threat to your godhood. So you control everyone around you to prevent it.
Precisely. But a truly dependent person, someone who has deeply internalized that they are a steward, not the CEO, becomes noticeably less domineering, less anxious, and far less self-protective. Because they are no longer carrying the agonizing burden of being their own God, they suddenly possess what the author calls the freedom to love.
Freedom to love.
Yeah, love is no longer used as a transactional tool to secure their own worth or to manipulate others into making them feel safe. Their identity and security are anchored securely elsewhere.
I love that this material doesn't just leave this as some lofty, unattainable, high-level philosophy. It provides actual, practical, uncomfortable exercises to build this muscle in real life.
Yes, the practical application is great.
The first one it mentions is the decision-making audit. This is where you literally look back at a recent major decision, a career move, a massive purchase, a staff firing, and you brutally ask yourself, did I genuinely consult God before the plan hardened in my mind? Or did I just ask him to bless it after my own momentum made it socially or financially inconvenient to reverse course?
It requires a terrifying level of self-awareness to do that. Another practical habit recommended is reflective delay. The holy discipline of intentionally not acting too soon, even when you have the power to do so, simply to ensure that fear or urgency isn't the one secretly driving the car.
That sounds really hard.
It is. And finally, the necessity of communal discernment. True dependence is never supposed to be an exercise in private isolation. We desperately need trusted, truth-telling believers around us to point out where our fear has disguised itself as wisdom, or where our raw ambition has cleverly borrowed holy language to justify itself.
Now, I have to say, reading about this surrendered life, it sounds incredibly peaceful. But for a type A personality, for an ambitious go-getter, for anyone raised in Western corporate culture, this sounds absolutely terrifying.
Oh, completely. It's an ego death.
Giving up the illusion of control requires facing the immense vulnerability that you might actually fail. It requires facing the fear that you might look incredibly slow or indecisive or weak to your peers in a culture that explicitly rewards moving fast, breaking things, and asserting dominance. So I have to ask you, the listener, directly, are you willing to look slow to the world if it means being completely accurate and structurally aligned with your deepest values?
The text illustrates this tension perfectly by contrasting two very different types of leaders. One leader moves with visible, undeniable force. They make immediate, sweeping decisions. They are highly efficient and project absolute certainty.
The typical corporate hero.
Right. But notice the wake they leave behind.
Yeah.
The people around them eventually become cautious, anxious, and obsessed with managing impressions because the leader's authority feels brittle and threatened by any questioning.
Wow. And the second leader.
The second leader is slower, quieter. They have the internal capacity to absorb uncertainty without instantly exploding into panic or demanding immediate resolution. They create an environment of profound psychological safety because their calm isn't a performance. It comes from a deep surrender, not from a forceful, overriding personality.
And the ultimate cosmic example of this surrendered strength, the text points out, is Christ on the cross. It is the absolute antithesis of human power dynamics. He hangs there and absorbs horrific violence. He actively refuses self-assertion. He refuses the temptation to call down legions of angels to escape the pain and prove his dominance. He entirely radically entrusts himself to the Father. It is the absolute agonizing end of self-reliance, and yet it is presented as the ultimate universe-altering display of true strength.
That is the beautiful, baffling paradox of dependence. It is not the opposite of strength. Dependence is the specific moral form that strength takes when it is finally cleansed and uncorrupted by human pride and frantic fear.
Wow. Okay, to try and summarize this incredibly dense, profound journey we've been on, we've traveled from recognizing the danger of using dependence as merely decorative language, the unused furniture in the living room of our soul, to the desperate necessity of living it as a gritty, functional reality.
Right.
We've looked at the psychology of moving from the exhausting, fragile illusion of control to a daily posture of active, ordered responsiveness. We've examined the subtle, insidious dangers of functional independence, where our organizations run with perfect efficiency but stop listening to God entirely.
Which is terrifying.
We've talked about the difficult pivot of making prayer the actual architectural blueprint instead of just the polite ribbon-cutting ceremony. And we've explored the difficult, countercultural, holy discipline of choosing the gentle whisper of discernment over the violent earthquake of urgency.
It is nothing less than a complete fundamental reorientation of how we view human agency, the nature of leadership, and the very definition of success.
And I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over as we close, extrapolated from what we've unpacked today. We live in a digital age where the very algorithms that govern our screens, our news feeds, our notifications, and our inboxes are literally scientifically engineered by neurobiologists to induce a constant state of urgency.
Yeah, that's their whole business model.
Right. They are designed to exploit our dopamine loops to make us react in milliseconds. So if true, operational spiritual dependence requires silence, if it requires waiting, and if it requires this reflective delay we just talked about, is it possible that our modern technology is not just occasionally distracting us, but is actively, systematically training our neurological reflexes to be functionally independent from any higher, slower wisdom?
If our daily environment trains our spiritual reflexes, that is a deeply unsettling question that we absolutely cannot afford to ignore.
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. If you're feeling a little exposed, well, that means you're paying attention. As you go back to your day, we encourage you to resist the noise and seek the whisper. And the next time you feel like you are cruising smoothly down the highway of life, totally and completely in control, just take 1 second to look down under the dashboard. Check your hands. Make sure your steering wheel is actually connected to something bigger than yourself. Until next time.